أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم صلى الله على رسوله الكريم وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين. Respected brothers and sisters here and online, Assalamu alaikum jamia wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have been discussing the Holy Quran, and in particular we have been discussing Surah Al-Fatiha within the Holy Quran. And every verse, every chapter, every letter of the Quran is something that needs to be reflected on. One thing that we often do is we often look at the Quran from, especially chapters that we're well aware of and we're acquainted with, we look at it very surface level. When in reality there's a lot more depth and there's a lot more layers to every single verse. And when you come to the mystics, when you come to the people who are the Urafa, the people like the likes of Sheikh Bahjat, the likes of, for example, Allama Tabatabai, and other scholars and other ulama, what they get out and what they extract from these verses is generally a lot more than what we typically do. So for example, there are numerous examples that we find in our traditions where the Ahlul Bayt, for example, have said, and the scholars have told us based on the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, that the power of, for example, Surah Al-Fatiha, it has been attributed in narrations from the A'immah that the power of Surah Al-Fatiha is such that if you were to sincerely recite it over the body of a dead individual, they should come back to life. Now, the thing is, do we recite it with that yaqeen? Do we recite it with that certainty? Do we recite it with that belief? And things of this nature. And when I recite it, is my understanding and my ma'arifah on the level of a scholar like Sheikh Bahjat or Allama Tabatabai or above that? Now, do they bring people back to life or not? I cannot comment on that. But what I'm saying here is, these words are alive, and this is a living book, the Quran al-Majid. And having said that it's alive and it's a living book, that means it must give us some guidance, but also it performs miracles, because this is a living book. It is a miracle. And we've mentioned this, and I repeat and I remind you that the different scriptures that Allah sent, whether it was the Tawrat or the Injil or the Zabur, they were great sahifas from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or suhuf. But they were not the Quran, because the Quran is the miracle. The miracles of the other prophets were their respective, for example, the staff of Musa or Isa bringing the dead back to life. When we come to the Quran al-Majid al-Furqan al-Hamid, so that means that we need to analyze and study Surah Al-Fatiha a little bit more, to get a little bit more in terms of the layers. We've covered it once at a very surface level. The surface level analysis is very quick. I want to now get to, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say that the entire Quran is summed up in this? How do we say that the entire Quran is summed up in 7 verses? 7 verses, that is, over 6,000 verses in the entire Quran, over 6,000. How is it that over 6,000 verses can all be summarized in only 7 verses? That means that the Quran is nothing but the expansion of these 7 verses. So when I look at these, do I really understand them in their truest sense? And so I want to spend some time to try to explore this, and perhaps we can discuss this together, inshaAllah. So at the first level, every verse of the surah is so comprehensive in its meaning that it's said that the meaning of the Holy Quran as a whole has been synthesized in this surah. This is exactly what I was getting at. That every single verse, and I've also mentioned this idea of, for example, there are complete du'as. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, or اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمُ. A complete dua. This is the ultimate dua that you don't need to recite, although there's benefit in reciting Josh and Kabir and all these big duas. But this one line of اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمُ does this just as powerful as many of these big duas. These other du'as are very powerful, do not get me wrong. Dua Josh and Kabir, the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Asma'ul Husna, are extremely, extremely powerful. But not everyone has the time to do that every single day. So what is the alternative? You can consider these verses. About the knowledge needed for man on earth, which has been accommodated in the Holy Quran, the announcement of the Lord. There is nothing wet or dry which is not accommodated in this holy book. لا رطب ولا يعبس إلا في كتاب مبين. And the surah is a quintessential of the whole of the Quran. Before attempting to explain the Quran as a whole, with the satisfaction of having done justice to the venture, one must remember what is said in the following verses of the Quran. That is, it is He who has revealed the holy book to you. Some of its verses are decisive, and some of it are the essence of the book. Hunna, the Quran says there are verses that are muhkam and verses that are mutashabih. Now this is something that will help us understand parts of the entire Quran, inshallah. There are verses that are muhkam and mutashabih. Muhkam are those verses that, for example, are clear and decisive. You read it, you understand it, and it needs minimal explanation at that, and it's very clear. There are others that are allegorical in nature, that may not be so clear in nature. And others are ambiguous. So as for those in whose hearts is perversity, this is really important. فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغ. The Quran says that there are certain people who in their heart they have this negativity. So those people will look at the verses and they say, this is all of this Quran, it doesn't make sense. And they'll try to play with the Quran. So the Quran gives us a standard here. For those who believe, who have taqwa and have sincerity, many of the verses are clear. Yes, there are still some verses that need explanations from the Ahlul Bayt, but there are others that are completely clear. Number one. But then the Quran says, look, there is a condition for us to understand the Quran. There's a condition for us to meet in order to reflect on the Quran. Because the Quran says in Surah Baqarah as well, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. This is a very important condition, that those who believe in the ghaib, those who believe in the unseen. And that is a very important prerequisite. If I come to the Quran and I come forward and say that, for example, the Quran is a book that is guidance, but, for example, I don't believe in it being guidance and I don't believe it being true, I will find and I will try to find mistakes in the Quran and contradictions in the Quran. Like many people have tried to do this. They have tried to find contradictions in the Quran. And some claim that they have found contradictions. And they say things like, for example, a very famous one that people come forward and say is a contradiction in the Quran, which is not a contradiction, but it's claimed to be by non-Muslims who try to criticize the Quran, is that Ya Ukhta Harun, in reference to Bibi Maryam, the Quran says that, O sister of Harun. So they say, well, how is it possible that Maryam is living many years after Harun? Harun was the brother of Musa. So how is the Quran saying, O sister of Harun? It's a contradiction. This is what they say. And the ulama have given answers to these questions, very clear answers. They said, for example, number one, who said it's that Harun? Number one, necessarily. A side note, in Judaism, the belief is Musa and Harun have a sister by the name of Miriam, not Maryam, Miriam. And so they're implying that maybe this is a contradiction, confusing the two. Of course, there's several responses to this. It was very well known that during the time of Bibi Maryam, if you wanted to say someone was salih or someone who was a good person, you would say brother or sister of Harun, because Harun was accepted to be a good person by that nature. So it's not knowing the layers of the Quran. That's why understanding the depth of the meaning of the Quran is very important. When you go to our scholars, Sayyid Sistani, Ayatollah Hafiz Bashir Najafi and other scholars, if you really want to get to the root of the Quran, I remember I was, as many of you have been in the presence of these scholars, I remember I was in the presence of Sayyid Sheikh Bashir Najafi in Najaf, and he said you have to have at least 10, the mastery of 10 sciences if you want to do a tafsir of the Quran and you want to really delve into the Quran. And that includes the Arabic language, but that also includes, for example, Arabic poetry before Islam. That also includes the history and the history of before Islam as well as when Islam came, because you have to know the Shan and Nuzul. There's many different logic, you have to know mantiq, you have to know a lot of different things, and when they all come together you get to the Quran, because the Quran is hikmah. The Quran is wisdom in its greatest sense. And that's really the essence of the book. So Surah Fatiha encapsulates that. Moving along. So thus under the divine declaration, man is definitively directed to knowledge of the Quran from the Holy Prophet, and in his absence from the divinely commissioned departure of this, called the Imams of the Holy Prophet. So that's exactly what I was getting at. There are some verses that were allegorical, the meaning of which only the Ahlul Bayt can tell us, and the Holy Prophet. And that's why we need to use them so that we don't go astray like the Al-Qaedas of the world and the other terrorist groups who try to misuse and abuse verses. I'll give you another example. There are verses of the Quran, for example in Surah Bara'at, Surah Tawbah, where people come forward and say, for example, that this is saying to the Jews, for example. And the ulama have answered this. Many scholars that say that, for example, this is not necessarily for all of the Jewish community. Allah has a different term for that. For example, Bani Israel. But when He talks about what happened in that context of what happened to Bara'at, there were deals or treaties that were being made between Rasulullah and these tribes that happened to be Jewish. And those people constantly violated the treaty. And when they violated the treaty, then Allah sent Surah Tawbah or Surah Bara'at. When He sent Surah Tawbah and Surah Bara'at at that point, which did not have Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, because Allah didn't want to show mercy, because He was enraged in some sense. But Allah doesn't get angry the way we get angry. Even that understanding requires some understanding. So that was a specific tribe. So if I'm a non-Muslim, as an example, and I come to read the Quran and I don't know the historical context as to why Surah Bara'at was revealed, then I pick up the verse and it says, oh, when the holy months have passed, kill and slay the disbelievers wherever you see them, ambush them. So I think the Quran is violent. You have to understand the layers of the Quran, the history, the science, the scientific references, as well as you have to prerequisitely, importantly believe in Hidayah, that this is a book of guidance. If you don't believe it's a book of guidance, what ends up happening is you try to find fault. And many people have tried to find fault in the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid. By the way, if there are any questions, please. Yes. I think you used the right term there, right? So there needs to be a... Yes, that's very important. In our modern world, we've somehow conflated these. And for those who know, it's a political movement that it was started, and Einstein himself was not, who was actually offered to be the leader of this movement. He himself, Einstein, rejected it because of its political... It was not a religious movement. And so I think there are many people who would agree with you on that concept, absolutely. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns that anyone had? I know many people have had questions and we haven't been able to address them. So if you do, just maybe you can raise your hand and I'll try to call on people, inshallah, and we can make this more interactive. So yes, the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid, it's the truth. And the Quran is going to tell you the truth to the point that our dear brother made was, Allah is going to tell you the truth no matter if you want to hear it or not. It's not what we want to hear, it's what's reality. I'll give you an example. When the Quran first came, there are Makki verses and there are Madani verses. As you know, Makki, there's 86 Makki. And we said in the beginning that Makki is based on the period of pre-Hijrah, and Madani is after Hijrah. And we said there's 28 Madani chapters. And mostly the Makki ones that came earlier on are shorter, because Allah is just focused on Usul al-Din. Now, what is the tonality of Allah? What is the tone of Allah in Makki chapters? Now, this Quran has come, imagine you're in Arabia, in Makkah with Rasulullah right in the beginning, and you're observing this. You're an Arab who has just seen Rasulullah, has gone to Qohe Abu Qubais, the mount where he said that if I tell you that there is an army behind this mountain, will you believe me? They all said, we'll believe you. And he said, then I'm telling you that there is no God but Allah and I am His messenger. And then the whole dynamic started. Some people believe, some people didn't believe, and all of this is in front of you. Now, if we're in there at that moment in time, and Allah is trying to invite, or if the Prophet is trying to invite people to Islam, what do you think the tone of the Quran should be? The tone perhaps should be more inviting. Or if someone is against, softer. But Allah takes a very harsh tone. The verses in Medina are much nicer. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe. Those are Madani, all of those are Madani. Allah has no interest. You want to believe? Believe. This movement of Islam is going to be successful. Whether you like it or not, He's telling the enemy on the other side. Whether you like it or not, Islam is going to succeed. You can either get on board or you can get out of the way. And if you don't get out of the way, we will move you out of the way. But of course, Rasulullah had a way of moving people out of the way. He was not into bloodshed. He often used the peace treaties, and he conquered the biggest strength of Rasulullah's Fateh Makkah in the 8th year of Hijrah, when they went from Medina back to Mecca, and they conquered Mecca without bloodshed. And that was Rasulullah saying that, look, this is a divine message. We can crush you, but we will not. This is the whole dynamics of the equation. Was at that point in time when Rasulullah emerged in Fateh Makkah towards Mecca, they came. The enemy on the other side was saying, Al-Yawm Yawm al-Mal'ama. That is, this is the day of revenge. Rasulullah changed one letter. He said, Al-Yawm Yawm al-Marhama. This is the day of mercy. But still, the power of Rasulullah was at the highest, at the peak. And he could have crushed them, but he chose not to, because it was a divine message. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, Surah Kafirun, La abudu ma ta'budun. For example, we do not believe what you believe. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, or for example, Tabat yada abi lahabin wa tab. Surah Lahab, the one that very strongly Allah calls out Abu Lahab. I mean, this was not a joke. Like, these Muslims are very small in number, and they're being persecuted very heavily. Like Bilal is in front of you, for example, what they put the stone on Bilal's chest and the likes. So you would think that if this was a book from a person, he would say, let's try to be nice about it, and let's try to get some support. There was none of that. Allah said, this is my world, this is my planet, this is my creation. And if you're going to oppress people, you're not going to stay for very long. So the tonality of the Quran, and especially in the Meccan chapters in the beginning, tells us that this is a book from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah has no fear of the consequences. And He knows that even if someone is martyred, like Ammar ibn Yasir's parents, like Yasir and Sumayya, their name will live on forever. But those people who, for example, were against Rasulullah, their name does not live on forever, or it lives on forever in a negative light. It's something to think about in the Quran. That why is it that the Quran did not mention Imam Ali by name? But Allah did not hesitate to mention Fir'aun by name. He mentioned many of the oppressors by name. Why? You see, there is a concept of even divine humiliation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if someone tries to become an enemy of Allah at that level, of Fir'aun and Haman and Shaddad and these people, Allah has no fear, because fear is something that we have as human beings. Fear does not touch Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That concept is ajib for Him, it's strange. We cannot even say something like this. You see, that's something that we have to survive in our minds. If you remember, a couple of nights ago I talked about, in the main lecture, or the Yasin lecture, about these two parts of our brain. Our brain, many times, understanding the brain is very important. There's a hadith from Rasulullah, or attributed to Rasulullah, that says, Man arafa nafsa, arafa rabbak. You may have heard this, very famous. The one who understands their own self understands their Lord. And one of the steps to understand is understand how our minds work. Our minds, according to psychologists, have one job. That job of the mind is to help us survive. That's the goal, to help you survive. And in order to help you survive, it makes automatic decisions and sometimes slow decisions. So one thing that the mind does, it over amplifies the signal of fear. So when something happens, you automatically get much more afraid than you need to be. Why? The reason for that is to protect you so that you do not go towards a threat and you do not get affected. But oftentimes we find that we don't need to worry as much as we often do. Many people spend their whole life worrying. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you have a relationship with the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala numerous times tells the believers not to worry. For example, when Allah told Musa's mother not to worry when she was putting the baby into the river. Allah told, for example, Maryam, and Allah told so many, the message, don't worry, because we are with you. That gives a principle. When Allah is on someone's side, you don't need to worry. That's why you'll remember some of the scholars who, for example, even in the most difficult time, they had trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Numerous examples. Whatever your view on the respective individual, they say Sayyid Khomeini, many of you may have remembered, you were alive during that time and seen this firsthand, that when he was coming back from France to Iran, they said he fell asleep on the plane, and he slept like he's never slept before. This is a human. But think about Imam Ali, Amir al-Mu'mineen, is much higher. When he never sleeps, his whole night he spends in ibadat and worship, and the Rasulullah asks him one time, sleep in my bed, when they're going for hijrah. And he sleeps a night that he's never slept before. That's the trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you have trust in Allah, it solves many of the problems. So I'll give an example to give you some stress alleviation for all of us. I was mentioning, for those who may have missed it, that the mind creates a signal of fear in order to protect us, and it over-amplifies the signal. It makes the signal worse than it is so that we protect ourselves and we don't go towards the threat. So what happens? Cornell University, in Ithaca, New York, they did a study they asked people, researchers at Cornell asked subjects to track their thoughts for a period of time. Track your thoughts. And they said, okay. And number one. Number two, then catalog and write down all the negative thoughts that you had. All of the things that could go wrong. All of the things that could happen that are not good. This actually has a good ending. So I'll explain this to you in a moment. So these people who are part of the study, they were writing down, this is what could go wrong. 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 I could lose my job, I could fail my exam, I could lose a family member, I could do X, Y, and Z. They made all of this list, and then they asked them to track, after another extended period of time, how many of these things that they wrote down on their list actually happened in real life. How many percentage do you think happened of the list that they made? Any guess? 20%. Pretty good. Anyone else? This is actually a pretty good guess, a very good guess. So the researchers found that 85% of the things that they put on their list never happened. That means 15% happened. But here's the very interesting part. Of the 15% of the things that happened, it was never as bad as they thought it would be. So for example, they said that, for example, maybe they'll have some decrease in income. Maybe they had a little bit less income, but it was never as bad as they thought it would be. If you connect this to what Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, is attributed to have said, he said, if you're worried about something, and you're constantly worried about it, of course within logic and mantiq, within reason, of a decision, and you're on the fence, this way could be good, that way could be good, but you're worried, he said, don't worry about it, proceed with it. Why? Because it will never be as worse as you thought it was in your mind, as you imagine. Because we often in our minds, we create the worst case scenario. Of course there's exceptions. Please don't apply this to every aspect of life. I'm sure you can find exceptions. But as a general rule, 85% of the time, the things that we are worried about, and I say this because I deal with a lot of youth, especially and young people, who suffer from anxiety. You see, in our modern world, and I've been telling you about this, depression and anxiety in particular has been rising very high in our society. Anxiety is like constantly worried about what's going to happen in the future. Am I going to be okay? Am I not going to be okay? And the short story is, generally, inshallah, you will be okay. Provided you take care of yourself, provided you do the right thing, and provided you not worry so much. We are constantly in a state of worrying and constantly in phobias. And this is what causes a lot of us to feel very unhappy and without having any ease. Number one. Number two, another problem on that is we don't have much social support networks. Alhamdulillah, we have a community here. But imagine, for example, we didn't have a community here. Imagine you were living and I know many people I go in the Carolinas and other places I've gone from majalis, they're not very strong, vibrant communities. And sometimes people have to travel very far to meet a community, even in our Shia community. And you see that has an impact on your life. Because who do you fall back on? Who do you socialize with? Who do you connect with? These things are very important because that's why the Masjid in the Islamic philosophy, it was not just a place to pray, although prayer is very important. It was a place to be a part of a community. It was a place. Why did Allah say, for example, do we reflect? One of the keys of the Quran is to reflect. For example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, pray to me 5 times a day, He said, don't stop there. After you're done praying, make sure you, before COVID, pre-COVID, and inshallah after COVID, shake hands with people. Why did Allah say that? Why did Allah say to make sure that you do musafa with people? Make sure you, and also don't stop there. Ask them, how are you doing? Say salamun alaykum, wa alaykum as-salam. But how's your day going? How's your life going? How's family going? You know, sometimes in 2007, 2009, everyone remembers the Great Recession. It was very bad financially. Also, for example, during this last COVID era, this last year and a half, For some people, it's been very difficult financially. Business is slowed, work is slowed, things of this nature. Do we talk about that with each other? Do we actually discuss that to try to make life easier for one another and try to solve problems for one another? You see, when we come to this is why we understand the first element of the Quran is Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us on the straight path. Remember, mustaqim is used here, it's used in Surah Yasin, it's used over and over again. Our goal in this life is to be on the straight path. So what happens? If I'm not on the straight path, that is the path if I'm unethical, for example. If I'm unethical, that has an impact on me and my community and my society. So I need to always adhere to ethics. You know, I often say this. Islam, in my majalis that I do in Muharram, the first Ashra, I talk about a concept of development. How do we develop a community? How do we develop a society? If Islam is a complete way of life, it must have given us some guidance on how we should develop ourselves and our community. Otherwise, it's not a complete way of life. Because Islam's more than a religion. So Islam should give me some guidance on what I should do in work. And indeed, Islam does. It should also tell me how do I build a system. And one of the main elements of Islamic system is to have trust with one another. I want to share a story with you very quickly. I remember I was in the UK lecturing one time and I met a brother who was from the Arab community and he was from Iraq. And he said that, you know, Sayyid, I was an engineer in Iraq and I had to leave because of the circumstances in Iraq and I came to the West. He said the first place I came to was in Germany. So when I came to Germany, I said I got a job in a supermarket, a grocery store. So that's all I could get. And I said, Alhamdulillah, it's good. Honest, hardworking, halal income. Very good. He said that my job was procurement officer. My job was to get the supplies into the grocery store. So my job was to work with the suppliers, get a good rate, and stock the shelves. Right? So he said one month passed, 2 months passed, 3 months passed, a year passed, so on and so forth. And I was doing a very good job because I was negotiating very strongly with the different suppliers. And he said one day my boss or the owner of the company called me into the supermarket. And he said, I have to let you go. He said, I was taken aback. I was shocked. He said, okay, fair enough. I came to this country, you gave me an opportunity. I'm very thankful. I'm very gracious of this opportunity. I understand. But I just want you to ask, if you can, just answer a couple of questions for me as I leave. He said, sure. He said, the first question is, you and I know that business is booming. Business is not going down. You're doing well economically. So it's not an issue of the times are bad or your business is bad. That's not the issue. He said, yes, that's correct. He says, number two, you know that I'm the best person at this job. You've never had anyone as good and I do my job very well. He said, yes, that's also very true. He says, then why? He said, you're absolutely right. He said, there's another reason which you may not have understood. He said, what is that reason? He said, the owner of the supermarket, he said, look, there's a system here and you didn't understand the system. He said, what's the system? He said, you didn't realize that all of my suppliers, they're from my community. When you negotiate very hard with them, it hurts them. And when it hurts them, it hurts our system. The man was from the Jewish community. He said, I cannot have you hurting our system, and I cannot have you hurting my suppliers who are my own community members. He said, I have to let you go. You see, there's a couple of elements to learn from this, because Ahlul Bayt say very clearly that wisdom is the lost property of a mu'min. You should get it from wherever you can. It is the lost camel in other riwayat. That's why oftentimes we can learn lessons from others. You see, these are principles that we had been given. I said this because many times when I travel globally, where Allah has allowed us to travel, many times people feel a reluctance, and I'm saying something that may be harsh, please forgive me, but sometimes you have to discuss these things. Many people, innately, they want to work in the community and do business in the community, but they lack trust. They're afraid of trust issues, because some people have been burnt. It's happened.
So the first principle in Islam is there must be ethics on both sides. You should not burn anyone, number one, Muslim or otherwise, number one. Number two, you should always do the right thing. So if you're an employee, you should work hard. And if you're the owner or the boss or the person who runs the company, you should also treat everyone fairly. There's numerous traditions on this. What does Islam say, for example? It says, make sure that you pay the laborer before their sweat dries. That's a principle that Islam has put forward. Similarly, Islam gives us guidance on all of these things. When we understand it, that's when we progress as a society and a community. If we don't understand it, we end up being subjected to possibly being at this risk of being the same thing and doing the same thing that the people who were in the early days of Islam were doing. So as I draw to a conclusion, do we want to see the Muslim communities prosper? I often tell people when we discuss, there's one community that 23.4% of all Nobel Prize winners are from that same community. And it's not the Muslim community. We need to get more people in that space. We have about 3 Muslim scientists who are on the Nobel Prize committee, or who have won the Nobel Prize in sciences. You have a brother from Egypt, a brother from Turkey, for example, and you have Professor Abdul Salam from Pakistan. Now, interestingly, on every other issue, and you'll forgive me on this, on every other issues, the Muslim community, inshallah we'll wrap up here, says that he's not Muslim because he's Qadiani, but when it comes to Nobel Prize, everyone brings him into this and says he's Muslim. Just because we need an extra Muslim person on the panel. You see, we have to be very honest with these things, we have to be very sincere with these things, and we have to address them head on. And that is what the Quran invites us to reflect on. Are we on Sirat al-Mustaqim? Ehdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, Sirat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim, ghayr al-maghdubi alayhim, wala al-dhalleen. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Do you have one? Where is this? If I can please request, inshallah, we'll have a Surah Yasin recited. If you could please recite the Surah Fatiha for Marhum Ibrahim ibn Mullah Tayyib Ali, who passed away in Africa. If you could please recite the Surah Al-Fatiha for the Marhum, who was the uncle of our dear brother Aqil by Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشى الرحمن بالغيب وبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشى الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثل أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إن تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة يردن الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفرني ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع الذين محضرون هو آية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من تمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أن حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشاء نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أن نطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميعا لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين ونعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أذل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة.